Have you ever found yourself in a place, maybe a religious setting or a cultural event, where modern practices seem to clash, maybe dramatically, with older beliefs?
Hmm.
Perhaps you've seen a tradition that feels incredibly ancient, deeply rooted, yet when you actually dig into its origins, it seems to contradict everything that supposedly came before.
Yeah, that happens more often than you might think.
There's something really profound, I think, and often, frankly, perplexing about how humanity grapples with mortality, with death, and what comes after, if anything.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental human question.
So today we're taking a deep dive into exactly that, the pervasive and often really surprising practice of ancestor worship, or maybe ancestor veneration is a better term sometimes.
Right. The terminology itself can be tricky.
Our mission here is to unpack its various forms, try to understand its origins, and explore how it's evolved across vastly different cultures. And we're using a really fascinating set of sources that get right to the heart of this enduring human phenomenon.
And what's particularly compelling, I think, is how this deep dive starts. It doesn't begin with some dry academic text.
No.
It kicks off with a deeply personal observation, a really vivid childhood memory, actually, that sparked this huge, challenging question about religious practices that just didn't seem to add up. It really sets the stage perfectly for this insightful journey into how beliefs about the afterlife, or even, the lack of an afterlife, have shifted and adapted over thousands of years.
And it's that very human impulse, isn't it? That need to seek meaning when faced with death. That's really the core of our exploration today.
It is.
We'll start with that personal account from our source, which paints this incredible picture of a childhood synagogue experience.
In Caracas, yeah.
Then we'll sort of peel back the layers of history within one major religion, Judaism, tracing its evolving understanding of death and what comes next.
Following that initial thread.
Exactly. And finally, we'll zoom out, fan out globally to see just how this deep-seated human need to honor the deceased shows up worldwide. We'll see common threads, sure, but also this astonishing array of unique expressions.
It's quite the journey.
Okay, so let's really immerse ourselves in this personal memory first. It comes from the author's childhood in Caracas, Venezuela. Imagine a synagogue described as large, grand even, but also unfinished.
Paradoxical right from the start.
Totally. Its facade, meant to be imposing, complete, was instead worn, weathered. It spoke of maybe a lack of maintenance, or perhaps just not enough resources.
A certain history baked into the building itself.
Right. And as you stepped inside, there was this expansive vestibule. This was the main way into the prayer room itself.
The first space you encounter.
And our source vividly described the actual prayer room as only partially maintained. Bare, dirty cement walls, stained glass windows that were clearly in poor shape. It creates this almost somber contrast to the grand, if unpolished, outside.
An atmosphere of slight neglect, perhaps.
And in that vestibule, the air itself was, well, a mingling tapestry of smells. You could pick out that musty scent of old, maybe abandoned building materials, a hint of dampness, dust, like a structure sort of stuck in time.
Yeah, that old building smell.
Then there were the more immediate human sense, the specific aroma of the older people who regularly gathered there for prayer, a distinct scent of presence.
Right.
But overwhelming all of that, dominating this whole sensory landscape, were the pervasive fumes coming from countless burning lamps and candles. The lamps, this was the first sensation greeting any visitor. Unforgettable, almost overpowering.
And it's those lamps, specifically called Sakaro lamps in the source, that are really central to this initial memory and the questions it raises.
Okay.
They were strikingly simple in form, really just ordinary drinking glasses, probably repurposed, filled with wax or maybe oil, each with a little burning wick.
Nothing fancy.
Not at all. Yet their simplicity kind of belied their profound purpose. These lamps were placed on these long, rough wooden tables, sometimes by the mourners themselves.
Right. Or sometimes the shamish, the synagogue sexton, would place them there at the mourner's specific request. Their entire existence, their whole point, was dedicated solely to the memory of someone who had died.
A memorial flame.
Exactly. And here's where the symbolic weight really kicks in. They absolutely cannot be extinguished. They're meant to burn constantly, relentlessly, without anyone touching them until every last drop of fuel is gone.
Wow.
And it's this unwavering flame, this continuous burning day in, day out, that created that pervasive, inescapable smell in the vestibule. It was the very first thing that hit you when you walked in, a constant, tangible, almost olfactory reminder of those who had passed away.
That's powerful. And the connection to the deceased didn't stop just with the lamps, did it?
Not at all.
Our source highlights another really profound practice, intrinsically tied to remembrance: the Kaddish prayer. The Kaddish.
It's noted that a significant proportion of the people who actually attended services, sometimes maybe even the majority of those present on a given day, came primarily for one reason: to say the Kaddish.
It's a major driver for attendance, yeah.
It's described as a solemn obligation for the bereaved. You have to pronounce it for 1 full year for deceased parents.
A whole year.
And for a period of 3 months for other close family members like siblings or spouses. Beyond that initial period, it's also recited at the end of services on major Jewish feasts and, crucially, on each anniversary of a death, the yahrzeit.
Right, the anniversary.
So it's this very specific, recurrent, deeply ingrained act of remembrance. It really weaves itself into the fabric of communal worship.
But here's where we need to unpack something important, because there's a really common misconception about the Kaddish.
Okay.
It is wrongly considered a prayer for the dead in popular understanding. You hear that a lot, both inside and outside of Judaism.
Right, I think I've heard that.
But in fact, its core nature, its text, is fundamentally a doxology.
A doxology, meaning?
Meaning it's a hymn of praise to God. It's an act of glorifying the divine, affirming God's greatness, especially powerful perhaps in the face of loss. It's not a direct prayer for the dead person's soul.
Ah, okay. That's a key distinction.
A huge distinction. Its association with the deceased comes purely from the fact that it's the mourner who is obligated to say it. That links the act of praise directly to the experience of grief and remembrance.
I see.
Furthermore, it's not something you can just say privately at home. It requires a minyan, that's a quorum of 10 adult Jewish men, for its public recitation. That really underscores its communal nature.
So it's a public affirmation by the mourner within the community.
Exactly. And the original intention behind this obligation, according to scholars, was pretty straightforward. It was meant as an honor, a way to provide comfort, solace, recognition to the mourners in their time of grief. A sort of communal embrace, acknowledging their loss through this act of praising God.
Okay, that makes sense. Consolation.
But here's the twist the source highlights. Apparently, the rabbis of the time, or perhaps over time, didn't find this idea of just consolation compelling enough, or maybe not motivating enough to ensure widespread, consistent synagogue attendance, especially for people whose main connection might fade after that initial intense mourning period.
Right, keeping people coming back year after year.
Exactly. So they seemingly replaced, or at least overlaid, this more abstract concept of consolation with what the source rather bluntly calls a superstitious folklore.
Okay. What was the folklore?
This folklore offered a much more pragmatic and frankly supernatural reason for saying the Kaddish. It proposed that the souls of the deceased, in order to actually gain entry into paradise, needed the active help of the living.
Whoa.
Specifically, the belief arose that by reciting the Kaddish, the mourners were effectively pushing them in their celestial ascension. They were actively helping their loved ones' souls get into heaven.
So the prayer became a mechanism almost.
Precisely. It shifted dramatically from being a doxology praising God, despite loss, to becoming an act of actively assisting the dead on their journey. This effectively transformed it into a powerful form of, well, ancestor worship, or at least ancestor assistance.
Wow.
And it is this belief, the source argues, this very practical, maybe fear-based motivation that made a significant contribution to, and certainly incentivized, consistent synagogue attendance across generations. People came because they believed their parents' souls depended on it.
That is a fascinating and quite dramatic reinterpretation. So, okay, what does this all mean when, as the source points out, the Old Testament itself contains nothing authorizing this kind of worship, this kind of belief about souls needing a push?
Exactly. That's the crux of it.
How did a practice so seemingly contradictory to the religion's foundational texts become such a central driver for people actually showing up, for communal engagement? The author's initial perplexity about this very contradiction, seeing those lamps, knowing about the Kaddish folklore, and then thinking about the Bible, that's really what kicks off this whole investigation, this deep dive. It prompts this profound historical and theological digging.
It's absolutely the central paradox that anchors this entire exploration. It highlights this remarkable evolution, maybe even revolution, in religious thought. because the Old Testament, as the source states very clearly, just doesn't have a concept of an afterlife in the way we often think of it now, like,
Yeah.
an eternal heavenly place for individual souls.
Right.
Nor does it really present the idea of an immortal soul separate from the body that continues to exist after physical death.
No soul floating off somewhere.
Not in that sense. Consequently, within its foundational texts, there's simply no worship dedicated to the dead after their burial. Burial is pretty much the end of the story for that individual's active existence.
So that core question just hangs there. How did this practice, this Kaddish belief, so seemingly at odds with the religion's ancient roots, become so central, so pervasive? How did it become a primary driver for synagogue attendance?
It really points to a significant and perhaps sometimes unacknowledged reinterpretation of core beliefs over centuries, driven probably by very human needs, the need for comfort, the fear of the unknown, and maybe by external pressures too.
Which brings us right to it.
Well-
This inherent tension between the established scripture and the evolving practice, it naturally leads us to unpack those dramatic shifts in how death itself was understood within Judaism, starting way back, with what the biblical period actually believed.
Exactly. We need to understand the starting point to see how far things shifted. And the biblical period's stance on death is, well, it's quite unique and frankly pretty stark, especially when you put it next to its neighbors at the time, like the Egyptians.
Right. Egypt was famously obsessed with the afterlife. Pyramids, mummification.
Precisely. The religion of the Old Testament, our source explains, was fundamentally formed in many ways in opposition to those elaborate Egyptian religions. Egyptian beliefs put this enormous emphasis on the dead. They saw this earthly life as just a preparation, really, a brief prelude to the real life, the eternal life after death, populated by gods, requiring intricate rituals, judgments.
A whole book of the dead.
Right. They built magnificent tombs, developed incredibly complex mummification processes, filled graves with everything you could possibly need for the journey to the afterlife. But the Old Testament, it presented a radically different perspective, a stark counterpoint.
How so?
Well, look at the Psalms. Specifically, Psalm 115, verses 16 to 18. It states it pretty clearly. The heavens are the heavens of the Lord, but the earth he has given to the children of men. The dead do not praise the Lord, nor any who go down into silence, but we will bless the Lord from this time forth and forevermore.
Okay, so a clear separation. Heavens for God, earth's for the living, and the dead are silent.
Exactly. It emphasizes the living's active relationship with God, the blessing, the praising, and the dead. They're characterized by silence, an inability to praise, a removal from that active connection.
Interesting. So not like Egypt at all.
Not at all. This stance actually brought the Old Testament's religion closer in some ways to the more pessimistic conception of death found in Mesopotamia rather than the optimistic Egyptian one.
Mesopotamia, like Sumer, Babylon.
Yeah. The key concept here in the Hebrew Bible is Sheol. It's often translated as the grave or the pit or sometimes the abode of the dead.
Sheol, I've heard the term.
But it's crucial to understand it's not a vibrant afterlife, not a heaven or hell. Sheol is consistently described in pretty vague terms, an obscure, shadowy place. The source calls it a faint shadow of the world of the living.
A shadow world.
And the crucial point is that in Sheol, well, basically, nothing happens or nothing worth mentioning. It's a realm of utter inactivity, silence, oblivion. The dead residing there, these shades, they have no real consciousness, no memory as we know it, no sense of time passing.
Yeah, it sounds grim.
It is, from our perspective, perhaps. Curiously, the text suggests that even in this shadowy non-existence, earthly hierarchies are somehow maintained. Masters remain masters, slaves remain slaves, but it's a completely static, passive state.
Huh. So status lingers, but nothing else.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
As the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 9, verse 10, bleakly puts it, there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in Sheol, whither thou goest.
No work, no knowledge, no wisdom, just nothingness.
Almost nothingness. The dead certainly don't participate in the joys or the activities of the living. They effectively cease to exist in any meaningful, active sense. They're gone from the world of action, consequence, relationship, except perhaps in the fading memory of those left behind.
Truly gone.
Now, there is one really fascinating and telling exception mentioned in the source. The prophet Elijah.
Oh, Elijah, the one who didn't die.
Exactly. Traditions like, placing a cup of wine for him at the Passover Seder, or the belief that he'll announce the coming of the Messiah. These exist precisely because the tradition holds that Elijah ascended alive to heaven in that fiery chariot.
Right.
He is unique, He's considered alive and therefore able to go back and forth between heaven and earth, unlike all the other prophets, and indeed the rest of humanity, who, after death, simply cease to exist in any active form. They go to Sheol.
So his exception proves the rule for everyone else.
Perfectly put. It underscores the general rule. So Sheol, in this original biblical understanding, isn't really life after death at all. The source describes it poetically as a little more than nothingness, but has a vocation to become nothingness.
A vocation to become nothingness.
Wow. It's a place of slow, inevitable extinction of whatever residual traces of life might remain. So the really profound insight from the biblical period is that early Jewish thought presented this radical counter-narrative to its neighbors. Death wasn't a gateway to some vibrant afterlife or a grand paradise. It was a descent into silence, inactivity, and eventual oblivion. Life's purpose, its connection with God, was emphatically here and now, on earth, not deferred to some other realm.
A truly stark, almost uncompromising vision of the afterlife. It really lays bare just how radical the later theological shifts must have been.
Absolutely.
And this is where the story takes that really fascinating turn, doesn't it? Because despite that deeply ingrained, quite pessimistic view of Sheol, something profoundly significant happened in the post-biblical period, roughly the time of the Talmud, and later to dramatically alter this long-held perspective.
Things started to change.
It's a powerful testament, really, to how external pressures, competing ideas, can fundamentally reshape even core religious doctrines over time.
Precisely. The source points very directly to the undeniable influence of nascent Christianity during this era.
Okay, how did Christianity play a role?
Well, think about it. The early rabbis were faced with what the source calls the success of the optimistic Christian offer, meaning the compelling promise Christian preachers were making, eternal joy in a heavenly paradise for the righteous, for those who believed in Christ. And coupled with that, the stark threat of eternal punishment and hell for those who didn't adhere to this new, rapidly growing religion.
The carrot and the stick.
A very powerful carrot and stick, offering definitive answers about what happens after death, answers that were both hopeful and terrifying. This presented a direct challenge to the traditional, much more ambiguous and frankly less appealing Jewish view of Sheol.
So, competition, in a sense.
You could definitely see it that way. The source says the rabbis had to turn their backs on their traditional pessimistic view and effectively make a competing offer.
They needed their own compelling afterlife narrative.
Exactly. This external pressure, this theological competition, seems to have led to a profound internal transformation within Jewish thought. Just as they began to adopt or adapt Christian conceptions of heaven and hell, Gan Eden and Gehinnom in Hebrew terms, they also, and this is crucial, adopted the idea of a soul that is separate from the body and immortal.
The immortal soul concept.
Yes. This was a radical departure from the Old Testament's more holistic view, where the person was a unified whole and Sheol was the fate of that whole person. Introducing an immortal soul opened up the possibility of individual judgment, reward, and punishment after death, mirroring the Christian framework.
That's a massive shift.
It is, and the author makes a very astute observation here. It's widely accepted, almost taken for granted, that Christianity was profoundly influenced by its Jewish roots, right? It drew heavily from the Old Testament, Jewish messianic ideas, ethical concepts.
Sure, Jesus was Jewish, the early apostles were Jewish.
Exactly. But the reciprocal influence, the idea that Judaism was also significantly influenced by Christianity, especially in areas like eschatology, the afterlife, the nature of the soul that's far less acknowledged, certainly within Jewish thought itself.
Interesting. Why do you think that is?
Well, the source suggests that Jews take no pride in it. It perhaps complicates the narrative of ancient, unchanging tradition. Acknowledging borrowing from a religion that historically diverged so sharply and often ended up persecuting Jews is, well, it's complex. So it's a less discussed aspect of Jewish theological evolution.
Understood.
Now, it wasn't a monolithic shift. There was a very significant dissenting voice during this period of adaptation. Maimonides,
A great philosopher, right? 12th century.
that's him, a towering figure in Jewish philosophy, heavily influenced by Aristotle via Islamic philosophers like Averroes. Maimonides vehemently denied the immortality of the individual, personal soul as a distinct entity surviving death.
Really? What did he believe then?
His view was much more philosophical, more nuanced. He accepted only the immortality of the intellect, the rational part of the soul, the gnosis. He saw this as the divine spark within humans, the part that allows us to know God. For Maimonides, the self that persisted after death wasn't your personal consciousness, your memories, your personality. It was an impersonal, intellectual connection to the divine, rejoining the active intellect.
Wow, that's very different from heaven and hell.
Very different. It was a highly sophisticated philosophical position, but it diverged sharply from the increasingly popular notion of a personal, immortal soul journeying to paradise or purgatory, which was gaining traction among many rabbis and the general populace, likely influenced by the surrounding Christian culture.
So did Maimonides' view prevail?
Not really, at least not in popular belief. The source notes that today there are extremely few Jews who share Maimonides' opinion. The vast majority of believing Jews, it says, share conceptions that are entirely equivalent, if not identical, with those of Christians. When it comes to the afterlife, believing in a personal soul, judgment, heaven, maybe hell, or some form of purification.
So that competing offer basically won out over time.
It seems so. It demonstrates this massive theological shift driven by a combination of external forces, internal debate, and the fundamental human desire for a more hopeful, more defined post-mortem existence than Sheol offered. It moved from a collective, shadowy Sheol to a much more individualized, consequential destiny.
What really stands out to you listening to this in this profound transformation? How does a religion with such a deeply ingrained ancient understanding of death manage to adapt and incorporate ideas, quite fundamental ideas, from those it initially defined itself against, often in direct opposition? It's a powerful, maybe often overlooked, example of how beliefs aren't static, are they? They're fluid. They're shaped not just by internal revelation or ancient texts, but by their whole historical, cultural, even competitive context.
Absolutely. It highlights the dynamic, living nature of faith, its ability to respond and evolve.
That said, it's really important to recognize that while this shift within Judaism, spurred partly by this idea of ancestor assistance, is fascinating, ancestor worship, or veneration, has taken a much more central and explicit place in other cultures throughout history, often woven right into the fabric of daily life.
Oh, undeniably. Judaism's case is almost subtle compared to some others.
So let's connect this to that bigger picture now. Let's explore some of those broader cultural manifestations moving beyond the Abrahamic traditions for a bit.
Good idea. And a great place to start is with the Romans.
Ancient Rome. Okay.
When we think of Roman religion, we often picture the big public stuff, right? The temples to Jupiter, Venus, Mars, the gods of the official state religion.
Yeah, the mythology everyone learns.
Exactly. And that cult was important. It was highly structured, celebrated with huge public festivals run by state priests who were essentially government officials. Their job was maintaining the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, ensuring the state's prosperity.
Keeping the gods happy for Rome's sake.
Precisely. However, the source reveals a really crucial distinction. The true day-to-day religion of the Roman people, or more accurately, of the individual families that made up Roman society, was actually the cult of the ancestors of each family.
Ah, so a private family religion alongside the state one.
Very much so. This was deeply personal, intimate, a familial practice, quite distinct from those grand public ceremonies. For many Romans, this formed at the core of their spiritual life, their daily piety.
Interesting. How did they practice it?
It was highly integrated into the home. In pretty much every Roman house, from a basic apartment to a wealthy villa, there was an altar specifically dedicated to this family cult. It was called the Lorarium.
Lorari.
And around this altar, regular offerings, rites, and prayers were performed by the household members. The specifics could vary quite a bit from one family to another. Each lineage, each gens, had its own unique traditions, sometimes its own symbols or coats of arms passed down through generations, connecting them to their specific ancestral line.
And who led these rites? Was there a family priest?
In effect, yes, but it wasn't a state official or anything like that. The priest of this deeply personal cult was the pater familias.
The father of the family, the head of the household.
Exactly. He held supreme authority within the family, and that included religious authority. He was responsible for performing these sacred rites correctly, acting as the spiritual intermediary for his entire household, living and dead.
Who were they worshiping, specifically? All ancestors.
Generally, yes, honoring the collective ancestors, often embodied in the Lauras, household guardian spirits, often seen as ancestral, and Penates, store-cupboard gods, also linked to family continuity. But the focus was often particularly strong on the most immediate male ancestors, especially the father of the current paterfamilias. It was very patrilineal.
Focused on the male line.
Very much so. And this emphasis on lineal descent had a really profound implication in Roman society. Dying without leaving a son was considered an absolute disaster.
A disaster. Why? Just inheritance.
Not just inheritance or property, it was a spiritual disaster because it meant the end of the cult.
Ah, no one to carry it on.
Exactly. There'd be no legitimate paterfamilias in the next generation to perform the necessary rites and offerings. This would effectively erase the family's ancestral line in the spiritual sense, condemning the ancestors to neglect and potential oblivion in the underworld.
Wow, that puts a lot of pressure on having sons.
Immense pressure, and it helps explain something you see quite often in Roman historical accounts and literature: adult male adoptions.
Right, adopting an adult heir.
It wasn't always just about consolidating political power or wealth, though that played a role. It was often fundamentally about ensuring the continuity of this vital ancestral worship, ensuring someone would tend the sacred flame.
Fascinating. Were there specific times this was more important?
Yes, much like what we saw hinted at in the Kaddish context and what we'll see very clearly with the Chinese, the first year after a death was considered the most critical period for offerings and rites in Roman ancestor worship, a time of intense ritual activity, mourning, and establishing the deceased in their new ancestral role.
And what did the Romans believe happened to the dead? Was it like Sheol?
It was remarkably similar, actually. The common Roman conception of the afterlife, outside of maybe some philosophical schools or mystery cults, was not a vibrant paradise or a fiery hell. It was more like the Greek Hades or the Jewish Sheol, a kind of minimal or residual existence in the underworld. Dim, shadowy, not much happening.
So, not something to look forward to.
Not really, but crucially, the more or less unhappy outcome of this shadowy existence, their status and comfort level in the underworld, was believed to depend directly on the quality of the worship that their descendants devoted to them.
So, the living had power over the dead's fate.
Absolutely. Consistent offerings, remembrance, performing the rites correctly, this could improve the ancestors' lot. Neglect could make it worse. This underscored the living's profound responsibility and also their power concerning their deceased kin.
And this wasn't just for the emperors and senators.
No, not at all. This ancestor veneration existed across all social classes. It permeated the very fabric of Roman society, from the grandest patrician villas right down to the humblest plebeian homes or even slave households who might honor their own ancestral spirits. It was truly fundamental.
Makes you think differently about Roman life.
It does, and the source even mentions Ernest Renan, the famous 19th century French philosopher and historian. He made a rather provocative argument for his time that the early Christians gathered in the catacombs not just to hide from Roman persecutors, but perhaps primarily to honor their dead, suggesting that this deep human impulse to care for and venerate the deceased was so strong it transcended even the shift to a new religious framework, adapting itself within Christian practices around burial and remembrance of martyrs and loved ones.
That's a really interesting point. Okay, so from the vast Roman Empire, let's shift our focus eastward now, across continents to China. Here, the source presents this cult of ancestors not just as prevalent, but as arguably the main form of religiosity for much of its history.
That's a fair assessment. For millennia, it's been absolutely central to Chinese spiritual, social, and ethical life. It's not a side practice. For many, it is the practice.
So how does it manifest? What does it look like?
Well, physically, ancestor shrines are ubiquitous. They are a central feature in the home, serving as the focal point for familial piety, for filial duty.
In every home.
Traditionally, yes, though the form varies significantly depending on the family's means, their financial situation. It could be just a simple shelf on the wall in a very humble dwelling. Or it could be a dedicated table, maybe a more elaborate altar, or even in more affluent homes, an entire room set aside, sometimes called an ancestral hall, perhaps adorned with portraits going back generations.
Right. What's typically in these shrines?
The core element is usually an ancestral tablet, often made of wood, which is meticulously inscribed with the ancestor's name and titles. Sometimes this is accompanied by an image, maybe a formal portrait, or more recently, a photograph.
Whose names are on the tablets?
It's primarily patrilineal ancestors, so the father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and so on, along that male line, and their principal wives are usually honored alongside them. It really emphasizes the continuity of the family name and lineage.
Got it. What else is there?
You'll almost always find an incense stick holder, often made of bronze or porcelain. Sometimes it's adorned with a golden flower, symbolizing purity and honor. Incense is burned regularly as an offering. Its smoke seen as carrying the prayers and respects up to the ancestors.
Incense, okay.
Then you have places for offerings. Plates specifically for food, typically things like cooked rice, fruits, maybe sweets, dishes the ancestor particularly enjoyed in life. And often small glasses or a set of teacups to symbolically quench the ancestors' thirst.
Food and drink for the spirits.
Yes. Some shrines might also display symbolic objects, maybe items that were particularly cherished or honored by the deceased during their lifetime, a calligraphy brush, a favorite pipe, something personal that connects the living to that specific individual.
Personal touches.
Exactly. And, of course, fresh flowers, or sometimes artificial ones, or garlands, or common offerings. They're regularly refreshed as a sign of ongoing respect, vibrancy, and care.
And this isn't just on anniversaries.
No, that's key. While major offerings happen on anniversaries, festivals like Qingming, Tomb Sweeping Day, or Ghost Month, small offerings like lighting incense, maybe offering tea, are often placed throughout the year. It represents an ongoing, active engagement with the ancestral spirits. It's like a constant dialogue between the living and the dead, keeping them part of the family's life.
It really is fascinating to see both the common threads running through these cultures. The ongoing remembrance, the offerings to nourish or perhaps appease the deceased, the belief that the living can influence the deceased state, and that strong emphasis on lineal descent.
The core impulses seem very similar.
And yet also the distinct expressions, like the specific structure of the Chinese shrine versus the Roman lararium, or the Roman paterfamilias as the sole priest versus maybe broader family participation in China.
Different cultural flavors, absolutely.
It truly highlights this incredibly deep-seated, maybe universal, human need to connect with those who came before us, to integrate them somehow into the ongoing life of the family, the community, even after they're physically gone.
It seems fundamental to how we understand ourselves in time.
Which brings us right back to that crucial question we touched on earlier. Given these diverse manifestations we've looked at, from ancient Judaism's evolving practices, influenced by that idea of assisting souls, to the deeply ingrained Roman family cults, and the pervasive Chinese traditions, can we say ancestor worship is a truly universal cult? Or is it really a phenomenon that's strong in some places, but may be absent or very different in others?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer, as is so often the case when we're talking about broad cultural phenomena like religion or ritual, really depends entirely on how precisely you define ancestor worship. The definition is key.
Okay. How so? Let's break that down.
Well, if we use a very strict definition, let's say, restricting it solely to direct ritualistic worship of specific named members of one's own family line by their direct descendants, often involving offerings and prayers to those ancestors for intercession or well-being.
Like the Roman model seems to fit.
Exactly. Under that strict definition, you'd clearly say, yes, it exists powerfully among the Romans, where the paterfamilias leads specific rites for his direct lineage within the household shrine. You'd say, yes, absolutely, for the traditional Chinese practices we just discussed.
But what about the Jews, even with the Kaddish folklore?
Under this strict definition, probably not. Because even with that later reinterpretation of the Kaddish, the prayer itself is still addressed to God. The practice might be motivated by a desire to help the ancestor, but it isn't direct worship of the ancestor in the same way as making offerings to the ancestor's spirit at a family altar. Their primary worship remains directed towards God, perhaps invoking the memory or merit of ancestors, but not worshiping the ancestors themselves.
Okay, so the target of the worship matters in that strict definition.
Precisely. Now, what if we adopt a slightly more flexible definition?
How would that look?
Maybe we broaden it to include more generalized reverence for forefathers, for the foundational figures of a lineage or a faith, acknowledging their profound influence, their importance, their role in shaping identity and transmitting tradition, even if not worshiping them directly as deities.
Acknowledging the shoulders we stand on, kind of thing.
Sort of, yes. A deep respect and invocation of lineage. If we use that slightly broader definition, then you absolutely can say that this kind of veneration or cult does exist among the Jews.
Wow.
It's evidenced by that very common ancient practice in Jewish liturgy where prayers frequently address God as Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, our God and God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right, invoking the patriarchs.
Exactly. It's not direct worship of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob themselves, but it's a profound, constant acknowledgement of their spiritual lineage. It's a deep reverence for the foundational figures through whom God's covenant was established and passed down generation after generation. It's a form of ancestral recognition that subtly but powerfully shapes their connection to God and their collective identity.
Okay, I see how that fits a broader definition.
Now, what if we stretch the definition even further, make it even more flexible?
Go on.
What if we broaden it to encompass a wider sense of reverence for foundational figures, whether they're human ancestors, divine figures conceived in parental terms, or even personified institutions that act like communal ancestors?
Okay. Where does that take us?
Surprisingly, perhaps, it can allow us to include even Christians in this category, in a certain sense.
Christians? How?
Yeah.
They explicitly reject ancestor worship, don't they?
They reject worshiping human ancestors as gods, absolutely. But think about the language and concepts. The Christian concept of the Trinity includes God the Father.
Right.
That's a foundational, ultimate ancestral figure in the divine sense. The ultimate patriarch from whom all existence, all fatherhood springs. The language itself is familial, ancestral.
Huh. I never thought of it quite like that.
And furthermore, particularly within Catholicism, there's a deeply ingrained concept of the Mother Church. The Church isn't just an institution. It's often personified as a nurturing, guiding, common spiritual ancestor for all believers. It provides sustenance, guidance, connection across generations, much like a venerated matriarch would in a family structure.
Mother Church. Yeah, that language is common.
And many Christian denominations also practice the veneration of saints. While saints aren't direct blood ancestors for most people, they function as spiritual forefathers and foremothers. Their lives are held up as models, their intercession is sought through prayer, their relics might be honored. It's a form of honoring foundational figures of the faith lineage.
So invoking saints could be seen as a form of ancestral reverence, broadly defined.
Under that very flexible definition, arguably yes. It taps into a similar human impulse to connect with, learn from, and seek help from revered figures from the past who are part of one's spiritual family. So, you see, depending on how wide or narrow you draw the circle of definition, what initially seems like a practice confined to specific cultures like Rome or China might, in fact, be a much more pervasive human trait, expressed in various, sometimes quite subtle or transformed, ways that link us profoundly to the past.
That really does raise an important question for us, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How much do our definitions, the labels we use, shape our entire understanding of these seemingly distinct practices? And what does that tell us about maybe more universal human experiences or needs bubbling underneath? It's a powerful reminder that labels can sometimes clarify, but they can also obscure the deeper connections, the underlying human impulses, like the need for continuity, the desire to overcome mortality, the respect for origins that might be driving these diverse behaviors. It makes you wonder how many other phenomena we've neatly categorized might actually be different branches of the same fundamental human tree.
A very good point. The categories can sometimes hide the connections.
Okay, so acknowledging that definitional flexibility, let's take that whirlwind tour now, looking at some of the other specific peoples mentioned in the source material, just to highlight the sheer diversity and pervasiveness of practices that fall somewhere under this broad umbrella of ancestor veneration across the globe. It's truly eye-opening to see the different ways cultures have approached this.
Let's do it. The source gives some really fascinating specific examples that show the incredible variety. For instance, the Waco people of California.
Okay, the WAPO.
They held these elaborate ceremonies where participants would actually embody ghosts. They weren't just talking about ancestors. They were inviting ancestral spirits to manifest, to be present among them.
Wow.
The primary purpose wasn't just remembrance. It was actively atoning for sins or offenses the living might have committed against deceased relatives. They were seeking forgiveness, seeking to restore peace between the living and the dead. And as part of this, they would make offerings to them, demonstrating this direct interactive relationship where the living actively tried to rectify past wrongs, ensure peace for their ancestors, and importantly, ensure the ancestors wouldn't trouble the living in return.
A very direct interaction.
Very direct. Now, moving across the continent to North America, the Iroquois Confederacy.
We're hot and sunny.
Yes. They celebrate numerous festivals explicitly in honor of their ancestors. Things like the Midwinter Ceremony or the Feast of the Dead were, and in many ways still are, major community events.
Not just quiet remembrance, then.
No, these are often active, vibrant, community-wide events. They integrate the ancestors into the ongoing life of the nation, seeking their blessings, their guidance for current affairs, for harvests, for health. Offerings, often of sacred tobacco and food, are common, reinforcing that continuous bond and reciprocal relationship.
Okay, let's go back to California. You mentioned another group.
Yes, the Yukots. Among them, the source describes a practice where the father would pass down a specific totemic symbol to all his children. This symbol belonged to his paternal line.
A totem, like an animal.
Exactly. It was typically an animal or a bird, maybe a bear, a coyote, an eagle, something significant to that lineage. And the crucial rule was that no member of that family was permitted to kill or eat that specific animal.
Because it represented the ancestor.
Precisely. It was considered a sacred embodiment of the ancestral spirit or power associated with that lineage. It wasn't just a symbol, it was an entity one might dream about, pray to. It served as this tangible living link to their ancestral line, believed to offer protection and guidance to the family.
A living connection through the totem. Fascinating. Where next?
Let's jump to Central Africa, to the Zande people.
Okay.
Their practice involves praying directly to their ancestors. They hold a strong belief that the deceased continue to exist in a spiritual realm and maintain a very keen, active interest in the lives and well-being of their living descendants.
So they're watching over them.
Watching over them and potentially helping them. Their prayers are often quite practical, asking for help with good harvests, for protection from illness or misfortune, for success in hunting or other endeavors. It highlights a belief that the ancestors retain influence, retain benevolent power, and can actively intercede in the world on behalf of the living if properly appeased and requested.
A very involved afterlife.
Definitely. Now consider the Aztecs of Central America, pre-Columbian Mexico.
Famous for their complex cosmology.
Incredibly complex. They held this elaborate belief that most of their dead had to undertake a long, perilous journey to reach Mictlan, their specific underworld. It wasn't necessarily hellish, but it was a challenging realm, described as having 9 distinct levels. And to navigate several formidable obstacles on this journey, treacherous rivers, mountains that crashed together, winds sharp as obsidian knives, the living had a crucial role.
What did the living have to do?
They were responsible for equipping the deceased with necessary talismans and gifts, which were buried or cremated with them. Things like jade beads, symbolizing the heart, offerings of food and water for the journey, even dogs believed to help guide the soul across a river.
So the living actively provisioned the dead for their journey.
Yes. And what's truly striking about the Aztec worldview, as the source emphasizes, is the blurred line between life and death. During specific festivals, like the ones that were precursors to the modern Day of the Dead, Dia de Muertos festivals, called Mikaluutontli, Feast of the Little Dead Ones, and Hermikailuuton, Feast of the Adult Dead Ones. During these times, the source states, the living would essentially converse and even party with the dead. The spirits of the ancestors were believed to return to Earth to visit their families. There were feasts, music, dancing, offerings placed on altars, ofrendas. It suggests this incredibly vibrant, continuous, integrated relationship where the deceased remained very much a part of the community's ongoing life. Not separate, not forgotten, but honored guests returning home.
That's incredible. A party with the ancestors.
Quite something. Now, let's go back to North America, to the Blackfoot Confederacy, also known as the Pied Noir people of the Great Plains.
Okay, the Blackfoot.
They exhibit a really profound, tangible, and enduring care for their dead. The source mentions that in some historical cases, they would actually carry a skeleton, or perhaps important parts of one, often wrapped in a leather bag or bundle, for many years after a person's passing.
Carry the actual bones with them.
Yes, incorporating the physical remains into their migrations, into their camp life, keeping the deceased physically present with the family or band.
Why would they do that?
It seems to be a truly tangible, long-term form of remembrance and connection. It embodies the belief that their dead are still part of the community, that they can still be influenced by kind treatment, by continued inclusion, and in return, the spirit might offer guidance, protection, or good fortune from beyond. It's a constant physical reminder of the connection.
A very physical form of veneration.
Extremely. And one last example from the source. The Samoyed peoples of the Eurasian Arctic region, Siberia, and Northern Europe.
The Samoyeds.
For them, the source notes, the single most important figure in their entire religious and social life is often the Kudardupor, which translates roughly as the tribal father or clan elder.
Is this a living person?
Often, yes, a living elder. But his authority and significance stem from his role as the embodiment of the ancestral line. He's not just a leader. He's seen as the paramount ancestral presence for the group. He embodies the collective wisdom, the spiritual power, the continuous connection of the entire lineage stretching back through time, connecting them to the divine, to the spirits of the land. His pronouncements carry ancestral weight, and his role is deeply intertwined with the well-being, the continuity and the identity of the entire clan, linking past, present, and future.
So the leader embodies the ancestors.
In a very real sense, yes. He's the living vessel of that ancestral power and tradition.
Wow, what a truly remarkable range of practices we've just touched on. From embodying ghosts for atonement, to feasting with returning spirits, to carrying bones, to revering a living ancestral figure.
The diversity is stunning.
And while, as we discussed, maybe not universally identical in their specific rituals or the precise beliefs underpinning them, it's undeniably widespread. It seems deeply rooted in so many diverse human societies across every corner of the globe.
It really does seem to tap into something fundamental.
And when you just think about the sheer demographics involved, the source makes a powerful point. Just consider the populations of China, India, where Hindu traditions like Shraddha involve ancestor rites, and the majority of other peoples across the Far East. That alone constitutes roughly half of all humanity.
Half the world's population.
And among many, perhaps most of these cultures, practices related to ancestor veneration play a absolutely central defining role in their religious and social lives. It really paints this powerful picture of a truly fundamental human impulse, this need to maintain a connection, some kind of relationship with those who have passed on.
Indeed. I think what all these diverse examples, from the subtle shifts in Kaddish interpretation to the elaborate Aztec feasts, collectively reiterate is a core, almost undeniable insight about us as humans.
Which is?
That fundamentally no human being, no human culture seems to be indifferent to the death of their fellow creatures or to their physical remains.
We can't just ignore it.
We can't. Whether it's through elaborate rituals involving offerings and prayers, or through simple acts of remembrance like placing flowers on a grave, or even through complex philosophical reinterpretations of scripture to make room for souls, humanity consistently, universally, finds ways to acknowledge, to honor, and somehow to integrate the deceased into the ongoing tapestry of life.
It feels like a universal aspect of the human condition, doesn't it? A testament to our profound need for continuity, for meaning, for connection that stretches beyond our own individual mortality.
I think that's exactly right.
And that brings us to the final thought for you, our listener, something to maybe mull over after this deep dive. This shared trait, this profound concern for the deceased, for their journey after death, for their memory, for maintaining some kind of connection, is remarkably unique among species on this planet.
It stands out.
We humans display this complex relationship with our dead, this ritualization of death and remembrance, seemingly unlike any other species. With perhaps one notable and really fascinating exception mentioned in our readings, we share this profound concern, this unique behavior, with no other species, except elephants.
Elephants, it's true.
Elephants, as observed by scientists, also exhibit behaviors that look uncannily like grief and remembrance. They linger by the remains of their kin. They gently touch the bones with their trunks, sometimes covering them with branches. They've even been observed revisiting grave sites, sometimes years later, pausing in silence.
It's incredibly poignant to witness or read about.
So the final question to leave you with is, what might this parallel say about our shared consciousness, perhaps? About our relationship with mortality, with loss, with memory? Why might it be that only these two species, humans and elephants, so different in so many ways, display such a profound, seemingly emotional, lasting connection to their dead?
Similar behaviors, yet undoubtedly vastly different internal experiences.
Exactly. What links us in this specific, profound way? It's a fascinating bridge, isn't it, between our own intricate human traditions, the ones we've explored today, and the mysteries of the natural world. It really prompts us to consider the deeper, perhaps even instinctual roots of this seemingly universal human impulse to care for, remember, and connect with those who are gone.
A powerful thought to end on.
We really encourage you to explore this fascinating topic further. Maybe reflect on your own cultural traditions surrounding death and remembrance, and think about where they might fit into this expansive, complex, and deeply human global tapestry we've only just begun to sketch today.